how did a book about an impoverished Moabitess ever get into our Bible? That is the question. In the ancient world, you would be hard-pressed to find someone less important, less notable than Ruth. She is the definition of a nobody, and yet her name is repeated alongside King David, Elijah, Jesus. How did this little story about like widows and a farmer in some tiny little village in Palestine become so celebrated that it was not only included in God's holy word, part of the scriptures, but actually set aside for one of the biggest moments in the worship calendar? At the Feast of Pentecost, they would stop everything right in the middle of coming together to celebrate the great story of Sinai. How God came down on Mount Sinai and descended in fire, interrupted the world, and changed the course of history by giving us the Ten Commandments and a relationship with his people, entering into their lives. In the middle of celebrating that, the ancient Jews would stop and read this little story about widows, farmer, village. That somehow the ancient Jews saw in the story of Ruth a way for normal people that would normally fly under the radar, people you would never hear about in history usually, to get in on this vast, epic, immense story of God. Which brings us to the question we've been asking now for 2 weeks. How do people like me find my place in the story of God? And we're going to use the book of Ruth as a guide. So last week we met Naomi. Her name means pleasant, but her life is anything but. She's married to a guy named God is my king, Elimelech, but there's a famine in the land, so they have to go to Moab. Ugh. So they go to Moab, and they have 2 sons, sickness and hospice. And then they go off and abduct for themselves some good Moabite women to marry. That's what they abduct them as to marry them. And then for 10 years, there's 10 years of infertility in there, and somewhere along the way, Elimelech dies. So get this, for a decade, Naomi's story is famine, unfulfilled longings, grief, no kids, no joy, suffering. And then finally, all the men in her life have died. The 2 sons die. And she hears that back in her hometown, Bethlehem, the house of bread, there's bread again in the house of bread. So we're going to go back, and she starts to head back to Bethlehem with her 2 daughter-in-laws, but she turns to them and says, you don't want to follow me where I'm going. You don't want to go where I'm going. It's going to be terrible for you. It's going to be terrible for me. I am a cursed woman. You don't want to be part of this. So Orpah, her one daughter-in-law, who is the namesake of Oprah Winfrey. Did you know that? Yeah. It was a misspelling. Anyways, Orpah turns back, goes home to her dad and to her gods, it says. But Ruth breaks the script. Because where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. And she shows this ferocious hesed. That's the word, the Hebrew word hesed. She says, I am not going anywhere. It is this loyal love, this unwavering commitment, this faith that risks everything. She says, I'm in with you. I'm in with God's people. I am following you wherever you go. So the 2 widows head off to Bethlehem. And Naomi then lets out this litany of complaints against God. And that is how Naomi gets into the story of God. And we're left wondering, what's going to happen with these 2? Like, will this hesed make any difference? Will Naomi's complaints find any answer? And then this week we pick up the story again, and we get to know the leading lady herself, Ruth. Ruth chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Now Naomi, pleasant, had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So, all the names have like meanings and hints in here. Boaz, we're not quite sure what it means, but it sounds like the Hebrew word for strength. So whatever, it's a strong name. And he is a man of standing. That could mean that he's like well respected in the community. It could mean that he's wealthy, at least compared to a bunch of impoverished widows. But it could also be translated, it literally means a mighty warrior. So Judges chapter 6, we find Gideon. He's hiding in a wine press, winnowing wheat. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then this angel shows up to him and says, Gideon, you are a man of standing, a mighty warrior. And we're not quite sure if the angel's being ironic, like you're hiding in a wine press, you mighty warrior, you. Or if he's actually seeing something in Gideon that will later come out. We're not quite sure. Either way, it appears that mighty warrior says less about your fighting ability than it does about the type of man that you are. So this man of standing doesn't necessarily mean one of these things. It's more just like this. He's a man's man. He's an Old Spice man. You smell like a man, man. Yeah, that's Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. So, ancient world, there is no welfare system. So they had a few social programs, though, that across the ancient world that they would use to care for. Remember, this is a man's world. So we talked about this last week. A widow with no sons has very, very few options for protection, for making money. This was one of the very few options. This is a God-mandated work program. So Deuteronomy chapter 24 explains what gleaning is. When you, landowner, are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, like you miss one, don't go back and get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. This practice is called gleaning. It's picking up the leftovers behind the harvesters. Ruth basically ticks all these boxes, so that's what she's doing right now. As it turns out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. As it turns out, in Hebrew, it literally says, her encountered, or you could translate it, she happened to happen, or she chanced to chance. Except the author doesn't believe in chance here. So this is one of those phrases like, she just happened to, by chance, stumble in to the field of Boaz. Wink, wink. What are the chances? That's the way it reads. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, and he smelled like a man. And greeted the harvesters, the Lord be with you. So this line, the just then, it's the Hebrew word henna, which is throughout. It's everywhere in the Old Testament. And there's a good English translation for this. It's behold, right? But we don't say behold anymore. I think we should, though. So from now on, it becomes the key transition word in this text. So from now on, we're just going to translate it the way it's supposed to be translated. Behold, Boaz showed up. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of the harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Now, stop right here. Don't read ahead. Right here, when you hear this response, Ruth does not know what to expect. The original readers do not know what to expect because she's a Moabitess from Moab, and she just showed up here. And it's like if a homeless person came up and just walked up on stage right now, you'd be like, oh, like that's the reading of the text right here. She is as vulnerable and as nasty as you can imagine in that ancient context. So we have no idea what's going to happen. How's Boaz going to respond to this Moabitess from Moab showing up in his field? But we're going to see that in the same way that Ruth surprised Naomi with her very unexpected act of kindness, hesed, Boaz is going to catch Ruth by surprise. Verse 8. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. Do you hear this? He says, I see your vulnerability. I see what's going on. I see that you are in great danger. Don't go anywhere else. I'm going to make sure that no man touches you, that you're safe. This is one of the original, this is a Bronze Age anti-sexual harassment policy. That's what he just laid down for her. I'm going to create a safe, dignified space for you to work because it's a dangerous world out there. And whenever you go thirsty, whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled. Okay, so this context, the lowest person on the totem pole fills the water jars. That's who does it. So men don't get water. Women get water for men, and young people for old people, and foreigners for Israelites. Do you see the totem pole there? But he just turned over the whole thing here. He just said, you, young Moabite woman, you can help yourself to the men's water whenever you want it. Whoa. Now this is the first hint that this story might just be a romance. So romance, it's really about the little things. I used to think that being romantic meant popping my pecs and spending $500 on an evening out or something, impressive as I am. But 2 decades of marriage have taught me that sometimes the most romantic thing I can do is the dishes. Yeah. Take out the trash without my wife asking. Flip over a load of laundry. My old mentor, expert on Song of Solomon, Tommy Nelson, used to say, a husband vacuuming is the sound of foreplay. Praise God. Boaz here, I want you to notice simple acts of kindness. He sees her vulnerability, says, I'm going to be a safe person for you. And here's just a little act of kindness, a little one. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? She gets it. No one else would treat her this way. Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. How you left after the death, you left your father and you left your mother and you left your homeland and you came to live with a people you did not know before. Do you hear the language here? He says, I've seen you, I've heard of your character, your hesed. You're a foreigner who left everything you knew, your country, your gods, everything, to go to a land that you did not know, just like Abraham. Do you know the story? Genesis chapter 12, God shows up to Abraham and says, I want you to leave everything you know. I want you to leave your country, your father, your mother, your homelands, everything, and go to a land that I will show you. And amazingly, Abram does and becomes Abraham, the father of faith. And so the author of Hebrews says it this way, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went. He left everything, even though he did not know where he was going. Even though he did not know, just like Ruth did not know. Boaz looks at Ruth and sees the faith of Abraham. This is not just my observation. Rabbis have been seeing this since before the time of Christ. This is an ancient observation. In fact, many commentators think that the story of Abraham and Ruth here gets so enmeshed in the minds of the Jewish people that when the author of Hebrews is describing Abraham's faith, he intentionally uses language from Ruth's story to describe Abraham because it's the same story in their mind. Do you hear that? Now, I said last week that there are no miracles recorded in the book of Ruth, but I might just have to amend it because this might be a miracle. I appreciate this. Boaz, a land-owning Israelite man, looks at Ruth, a widowed, impoverished Moabite woman, and he sees through the cultural prejudice. He sees through the gender barriers, beyond the historical hatred, over the economic gap, and he sees in this impoverished Moabite woman the faith of Abraham. And that just might be a miracle. God seems to delight in hiding greatness in humility. So how does the eternal Son of God show up in our world? As a carpenter's son. What is God's victory? His greatest victory, the victory that sets all victories aside. The victory of the universe is Jesus writhing on a Roman cross. And how do we experience salvation? The greatness of salvation, like new life and like this life-giving force in us that God is changing us from the inside. How do we experience that? Water. You dip someone in water called baptism. Not holy water, just any water will do. You dip someone in water. And then how do we feed on that? Through the most common food of Jesus' day, bread and wine. Just the most common thing you could find. It's humble. Almost embarrassingly so. And this seems to be on purpose so that the proud will see it, but not see it. Like they'll see it and they'll look right past it because it doesn't seem great to them. Only the humble can get in on this story, on what God's actually doing right now in our world, which begs the question, are we able to see what God is doing in our world right now? Are we humble enough to see greatness when God presents it to us? If I bumped into Ruth the Moabitess today, would I see the faith of Abraham, or would I just see an impoverished immigrant on a social welfare system? So when I was in my 20s, there's no question, my thought of greatness, in God's terms, God's greatness was the conference speaker who spoke to thousands, the person who led ministries of, giant ministries, the mega church pastors. I wouldn't have said it so bluntly probably, but that's clearly who I looked up to, who I emulated. And then a few years ago, went home, visit some people where I grew up, and went to the church that I had attended growing up. And the pastor there, not a great leader, not a great preacher. The church had shrunk over the years. My wife and I went to one of the worship services, and the most gracious way I can describe the worship set was Christian karaoke on a really bad night. And I remember growing up, I was actually kind of embarrassed by the church, the whole thing. But there, I had lunch with him and started just catching up. And he and his wife, they have a special needs son. 30-some years ago, he had suffered brain trauma, never recovered. And so he's kind of at like a 2-year-old level, nonverbal, can't move around on his own, things like that. But the way that happened was almost certainly his caretaker shook him as an infant. That caretaker attends their church and has for the last 30 years, and he's loved that person and shepherded that person for the last 30 years. A couple years ago, his wife's coworker was an abused woman, and she had no family, no economic support system, no one to fall back on, and her whole life collapsed. She finally left her abusive husband, and so they literally adopted her. They couldn't legally adopt her, but they took her into their home, took care of her. She actually took their last name, and her kids now call them Grandma and Grandpa. I mean, that's the level of adoption. They poured out their life to her, and I sat there, and I started hearing these stories and just watching their life, and I saw how horrifically hard their life had been, and how so humble it had been. And I saw how they had just faithfully loved the people that God had put in their lives, no matter what. And I thought, maybe that's what greatness actually looks like in God's kingdom. Maybe I grew up seeing greatness, but I was too arrogant to see it. Boaz, though, he's different. The greatness of Ruth's faith, he sees it, and he pronounces a blessing over her. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. He's pulling out this language from Deuteronomy and from Exodus 19, from Isaiah 31, this language of the Lord is like an eagle. May his wings cover you and give you refuge and rest. He prays this blessing over Ruth. And then Ruth says, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here and have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." Now this just reads like another line to us, right? Because the main reason we eat is to get nutrition in our body, right? We are as practical as they come as far as peoples around the world. But back then, and still a lot of places around the world today, eating was not primarily about getting nutrition in your body. It had symbolic meaning. The people you ate with were your companion with bread. They were your friends. There was a covenantal relationship of eating together. So this is where people become friends. This is where relationships are formed. This is where you share life. So this is significant that he's sharing his life. This is why, when you think through the significance of eating together, this is why the religious people were so upset with Jesus, eating with tax collectors and sinners, because he's sharing his life with them. This is why you read at the Last Supper, John chapter 13, Jesus is so hurt by Judas's betrayal. Why? He quotes Isaiah 41. He says, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me, we shared wine vinegar. That person will betray me." Why is it so hurtful? Because Judas, I've eaten with you. I shared my life with you. We're friends, and you betrayed me. Here, Boaz inverts the whole thing, though. He says, over a meal, he's inviting her into relationship. And you can hear over this whole scene as Boaz invites her in, shares this, says, "Take this, taste and see, be part of this. I'm going to care for you." As he does this, the Lord whispers a blessing over the background. Watch this. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. So 2018, had a chance to go to Israel with a bunch of rabbis, clergy and rabbis, a group of us. And we're sitting there at Tegba, which is the historic site where Jesus multiplied loaves and fishes, fed the 5,000. We don't know that it's actually the site. It's just declared. Constantine's mom showed up there 1,700 years ago and said, "This is the site." And everyone's like, "Okay, let's build a church." So we don't know. But it's somewhere in that region, right? So we go there and we tell the story, and then we bust out the scriptures, and we read Mark chapter 6, the scene in which Jesus multiplies loaves and fishes. And that scene ends with this line: "They all ate and were satisfied," and then there's leftovers. I don't think anything about it. I'm like, of course, they ate, now they're full. That's what that means. But my rabbi friend, Jeremy, turns to me and says, he never heard this story before. So this is like shocking him. He hears this and says, that's a Hebrew blessing. That's a Hebrew blessing. That's what Mark chapter 6 is saying right there. It's Deuteronomy chapter 8. "When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you." He's brought you into the promised land, and he's giving you the blessing. That's what that means. So Mark is not just talking, oh, they ate their food, now they're full. He's saying, no, Jesus gave them food, and now they're experiencing the blessing given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's happening right in their lives. The rich, deep fullness of life that God promised to his people is happening. That's what Jesus is giving them. And that is what Ruth is experiencing. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. This is not just a statement about how full she was. This Moabite woman is experiencing the blessings of God in the promised land. This Moabite woman is having the blessings of God poured out upon her like she's a child of God. It's shocking. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some of the stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered, Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. So let's talk here. We're bumping into agricultural terms here, and I'm guessing that not a lot of you have threshed wheat recently, all right? So we're going to do this. Biblical Farming 101. This will help in one of two situations here. One, if the government comes crashing down and like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome becomes a reality, seems highly probable these days. If that happens, you should understand the basics of harvesting your own wheat. Or two, if you're reading your Bible and you keep bumping into these images of chaff and threshing and winnowing and harvesting, what? Somehow these wheat harvesting terms underpin so many of the spiritual metaphors throughout the scriptures. Either way, this could be helpful. So, when you came in, we gave you a stalk of wheat. This is a stalk. So you're harvesting wheat, so you go in and you cut the stalk. You guys got your stalks? Yeah? So you got your stalk right here. And this is actually, the stalk's actually bigger than this. This is an ornamental stalk, but you get the idea. And then you thresh the wheat. We have an image of this from modern day India, where you beat it. And then this has actually already been degrained. But the grains, you can see in these little things, these are actually grain holders. The grains then pop out, and what you get from that is wheat berries, right? Wheat berries. That's what those are called, the little grains. And so when those come out, though, they're not yet ready to eat. There's one more step. You have to wait for them to dry out, and then you throw them into the air. We have a little example of this called winnowing, and that helps separate the berry itself from the little husk on the very outside of it called the chaff. And when you throw it in the air, the chaff will blow away and the berry falls to the ground, and then you collect the wheat berries at the end, and you can finally make your bread. Got it? Makes sense? All right, now you are ready to read your Bible or survive post-apocalyptic America. All right. But I want you to notice, if you go back to that passage there, when she had gleaned nearly an ephah of wheat. That is 45 pounds of wheat. That is not a normal day's worth of wheat to pick up. This is enough to feed her and her mother-in-law for like months, all right? And then it suggests that Ruth herself, the woman worked out. Her mother-in-law asks, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." She says, this didn't happen on its own, right? Something's going on here. And then watch the way Ruth drags this out, like the punchline. Are you ready? Are you ready? She's like, then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. Are you ready? Are you ready? The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. She drags it out as long as she can. And then Naomi's like, "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "This man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Guardian redeemers. It's usually translated kinsman redeemer, but I guess the NIV likes like the superhero phrase there. Guardian redeemer. Anyways, we'll explore this more next week, but in broad strokes, you need to understand this. In the ancient Near East, you were supposed to take care of your extended family, your extended relatives. In ancient Israel, you were, language, your brother's keeper. You get it? You're your brother's keeper. So these were formalized things. This whole process was formalized in a kinsman redeemer or guardian redeemer. It's a near male relative whose responsibility it is to make sure your family and our clan, your family, our clan, our families together, stay healthy, whole, protected, especially when disaster strikes. So, Leviticus chapter 25, let's say you get in economic trouble and you have to sell your property, or heaven forbid, you have to sell yourself into slavery. Your kinsman or guardian redeemer can come in and purchase your property so it doesn't leave the family, or they can purchase you. They can redeem you out of slavery. They can set you free. Or, let's say, Numbers 35, someone murders your husband. There's no police. There's no FBI. So what's a widow to do? This is when you call on your guardian redeemer They become, and I quote, an avenger of blood. Numbers 35, the avenger of blood shall put to death the murderer. When the avenger comes upon the murderer, the avenger shall put the murderer to death. As barbaric as it sounds, this is the only justice available to women like Ruth and Naomi. So Boaz, that mighty warrior, is a guardian redeemer. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, he even said to me, stay here with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. It's a dangerous world. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So quietly, unexpectedly, the Lord is working. Like this story of grief and loss and unfulfilled longings is becoming a story of blessing and surprise and unexpected faith, unexpected chesed. So their physical hunger has been filled, but now there's still this relational need, this insecurity looming out there. Chapter 3. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now behold, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Winnowing, remember, you throwing up the grain and trying to separate it from the chaff, usually at a high place on a hill so that the wind would blow it away. We find that this was not just part of the work, though. This is after all the harvesting is done. Then it's kind of like a boys' party. All the men go out there, they winnow, and then it's a big celebration at the end of the harvest. So think huge party. Here's where the juicy part comes in. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. It sounds like she's telling her to get ready for a date. It doesn't actually say put on your best clothes there. Let me nuance that. It just says put on your clothes. Scholars think that what that means is the best interpretation is probably not like put on those skinny jeans. The ones, don't do that. No. It probably means take off the mourning gown. Back then, widows would wear a mourning gown to represent that they were in a season of mourning for their husbands. And she's like, take that thing off. Let them know you're back on the market. That's the message there. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. Let him get a little tipsy. And when he lies down, note the place where he's lying, and then go uncover his feet and lie down. He'll tell you what to do. Now, what do we make of this? Now, it could mean you wore your garment as a blanket. That's what they did, the outer garment. It could mean, hey, just tuck his feet out of his outer garment so his feet are sticking out. And remember, you're in this windy place where you winnow. So the wind will tickle his feet, and then eventually he'll wake up and be like, oh, who's this next to me? It could mean that. But if you read your Bible, the wording seems wildly inappropriate. So just a few examples. Genesis chapter 9. Noah gets off the ark, plants for himself this beautiful vineyard, and then proceeds to get blasted drunk. So drunk that he lies uncovered, same word, in his tent. And we're not quite sure what happened, but whatever happened, when he sobers up, he's so mad that he curses for generations to come his own grandson. Something happened there. Genesis 19, the story of the Moabites. Lot's daughters get him nice and drunk, and then after he's drunk, they lie with their dad. Same words here, lie with their dad. The language of to lie with something occurs repeatedly throughout the Old Testament. In all but 2 verses, they aren't just lying there, friends. Feet. Throughout the scriptures, to uncover one's feet is to uncover usually a lot more than your feet. It's commonly used as a reference to things that shall not be said in a worship service, right? Exodus chapter 20, verse 26, this is my favorite. The priests are specifically instructed in the law of God to wear underwear. For heaven's sake, I love the fact that God has to tell them to wear underwear. There's special holy underwear they have to wear, though, because when you go up on the altar, you're going to uncover yourself. Same word. You're going to flash everybody. Don't do that. That'd be totally awkward. Leviticus 18, the word uncover, same word used in Ruth here. The exact same word is translated sexual relations in the NIV. And not once, not twice, 24 times. Numbers 25. Moabite women seduce the Israelite men so that they can lie with them. Same word. The prophet Ezekiel is going to use such graphic terms with these phrases that I refuse to read it from the pulpit. I'm not joking. You're going to have to read that smut on your own. So do you see a theme building here? Uncover someone's feet, lie down. Add to this a bit of cultural context that prostitution was widespread and socially acceptable at the time. We get this little comment from ancient Near Eastern expert Daniel Block. He says this: at winnowing time, the threshing floor often became a place of illicit sexual behavior. Realizing that the men would spend the night in the fields next to the piles of grain, prostitutes would go out to them and offer their services. The word of the Lord. So I'm listen to this. I am not saying that Naomi was telling Ruth to wait until Boaz was drunk and then take off his pants and act like a prostitute. I'm just saying that everything in this verse is, to quote Block, gloriously ambiguous. Like, it's intended for you to read this and be like, did she just say what I think she said? That's the way this is written. All right? When he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Go, uncover his feet, and lie down. He will tell you what to do. And Ruth says this: I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. We will not see courageous faith in the midst of something that seems so wildly inappropriate. We will not see this again until the angel Gabriel shows up to a virgin. It says, you're going to be pregnant out of wedlock. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned and said, "Behold, there's a woman lying at his feet." "Who are you?" he asked. And she's going to turn this around. The question's not, who am I? The question is, who are you? "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." And here is where Ruth breaks the script. She's done exactly what Naomi told her to do until this moment. She doesn't wait for Boaz to tell her what to do. She tells him what to do. She says, "Spread the corner of your garment over me." Again, this phrase is gloriously ambiguous. It could mean, hey, can I crawl into bed with you? But it can literally be translated, "Spread your wings over me." You know that prayer you prayed, Boaz, where you prayed that God has taken me under his wings, the refuge of his wings, so I could find rest and refuge. I think God's answered my prayer. You're the answer. However we read this is clearly about marriage. To this day, at some Jewish weddings, the groom will cover the bride with his talit, a prayer shawl. So here's an example. It's actually a picture from Etsy. You can buy that prayer shawl for $364, by the way. Yeah, just if you want one. Yeah. So, but the image, you get the image here. The bride is invited to find rest and refuge in the groom. And if you set aside just for a minute all of our modern gender biases, you have to admit, finding someone who wants to be for you a rest and a refuge, an oasis, a place of safety, a safe person, a truly safe person. I don't care if you're a man or a woman, that's beautiful. And it's no accident that this is the very language that God uses of us in the New Testament, of Christ and his church, his bride, coming under his wings. But here's the point. When she says, spread the corner of your garment over me, she just asked Boaz. She didn't ask. She told him, you need to marry me. That's what she said. Now, I'm not sure that any of us can quite appreciate how shocking this thing would be to the original audience, because women never asked men to marry them back then. In fact, that wasn't even a thing. Marriage was technically legally between two men. It was between the father and the groom. They would make a deal and broker the woman was just passed between two men. That's how it went. But Ruth, she breaks the script. She commands, demands, and says, marry me. That's what you need to do. God is telling you through me. You prayed, you answered it. Now, I'm not sure we can appreciate how risky this is, too. Because she shows up at the boys' party, her and the prostitutes. She uncovers his feet. How's he going to respond? He could use her and throw her away. Or he could be righteous and rebuke her, and he could exile her from the community. He has that power. He could have her beaten and shamed. So this is massively courageous. She breaks her script and speaks up not just for herself, for her mother-in-law and for her deceased husband. So Ruth, the immigrant, the Moabitess, the impoverished, voiceless woman who's never had a say in her own life. She never had a say in her own life. Her first marriage, she was abducted. She couldn't have kids when she wanted to. She's never had a say in where she would go or what her life looked like. And yet somehow, she gets in on this story of God. How does someone like Ruth find her place in the story of God? The answer is she breaks the script. She takes the initiative. She shows courageous faith. It's fascinating. For Naomi, she gets in on complaining. But Ruth, she gets in on taking the initiative. First, she breaks the script by not going back to her family. She says, no, I'm going to do the hard thing and I'm going to follow you and God's people. And then she takes the initiative to glean and provide for her mother-in-law. And then by chance, she just happened to stumble into, by chance, Boaz's field. And then she takes this massive risk and shows up in the middle of the night and says, Boaz, you need to marry me. So I am always taken aback by that passage in Revelation chapter 21, when it describes those who will not make it into the kingdom of heaven. It's worse than that. They will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. You know the first person on that list? The cowardly. The person who lets fears control their lives. The one who never steps out in faith, never risks looking dumb, never speaks up, never shares their struggles, never has that conversation that they know they need to have, never becomes vulnerable, never opens up their life to someone else, never makes the ask, never challenges the script they've been handed by the world. You tell me your greatest fears, and I will tell you your greatest temptations. You see, any good story, and the story of God is the greatest. Any good story is not a safe story. Safe stories are boring. There are stories that no one wants to hear, read, see, or live. If you want to get in on God's story, you have to give up your perfectly safe story that you control. You can't write it. God writes it. The wonderful thing, the terrifying thing about God's story is that it's not up to you what happens next. It's up to Him. So I just want to close today with a question. What risk might God be inviting you to take? Like, what courageous act of faith might God be inviting you to take? Like, who today needs to break the script and, I don't know, quit your job? You know that God's been prompting this in you, and you've just been ignoring it. You're too afraid. Who needs to have that hard conversation with someone? Like, you don't know how they're going to respond, so you've been putting it off and putting it off. Who needs to talk to their coworker about Christ? Who needs to finally be vulnerable with someone? Like, you've been hiding for years, you feel unknown, but you refuse to open up. Who needs to confess? Who needs to finally be generous because money has a grip on your life and you need to start letting it go? Who needs to cross that racial or political or socioeconomic boundary and meet a real live Ruth the Moabitess today and see greatness in her. All of this assumes something, though. You will never want to take this risk until you've first found refuge and shelter in the wings of God. It is only when we find security in knowing that I am loved by God and I can rest in him that I could possibly take these risks. And so maybe that's the risk you need to take today. Maybe you've never taken that. Maybe you need to let down your guard and let God love you. Accept that you don't have all the answers. You don't know where your life's going. You don't write the script. And accept that Christ died for you, that he loves you. Hesed, I am not going anywhere. And let him be your cover, your refuge, and your risk. What risk do you need to take? Father, I pray, Lord, that you would allow us to not be controlled by fear. I pray, Lord, that you would give us the courage to step out in faith, not self-serving courage, but hesed that we see in Ruth, Lord. I pray that we would not be a cowardly people. So God, I don't know what your Spirit's prompting in hearts today, but I pray that we would be a people who listen and act. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.